Hello and welcome to the third episode of the Conatus News podcast. Although going forward, we're looking at calling it Conatus Views because we've been focusing primarily on the video aspect, although we are intending to go on SoundCloud at some point once that's all set up. Today, I'm joined by Beatrice, who has been a big figure at Conatus News. She's been a veteran. She's been with us for a long time now. She's probably done more than anyone for the site. So we're all very grateful for everything you've done, and we're very glad to have you on today, Beatrice.
Thank you, Dan. I'm so happy to be here, and very nice to see how the podcast/views is coming along. We've been hearing about it from the back end, but it's very exciting to be on.
It's great to have you. So we were thinking of talking a little bit about Conatus News to start with, about what our mission is, the way that we as individuals see it.
Mm-hmm.
We have in the conversation about problems that we've been having with the left, there's been a tendency to go over to the other side. People seem to think that the right wing is going to defend us in terms of freedom of speech and so on. And yeah, to me, the way I see it is at Conatus we have something of a commitment to universalism and universal human rights. And that doesn't mean that all of our writers, and so on are going to be coming at it from that perspective, because we're interested in hearing from all sorts of perspectives. But I think that is the viewpoint that we are coming at it as a team from. And that's very important because to us, it's very easy to criticize, say, the left, criticize social justice, whatever, from a perspective where you were never interested in those things in the first place. It's very easy for a right winger to say, oh, well, these problems with the left. But if we want to actually improve the political discourse, we have to respect everyone. We have to respect our opponents and our allies. But that means talking about hard truths. We believe that respect for universal human rights is totally compatible. It has to be compatible with criticism of everything, basically. Criticism of cultural practices, criticism of religions, criticism of ideas. That is a key fundamental component in respect for universal human rights. And that's my perspective.
I think definitely we do have diverse perspectives, especially I would say different backgrounds as well. We come at it from different angles. But I also do think that there are some positions that we've decided is not going to be things that we are compromising on, one of which is definitely, universal human rights, basic freedoms. And so in terms of, when we talk about mainline conservative opinions, or mainline libertarian perspectives, Conatus as such leans more towards perspectives that lead to larger social good. But yeah, certainly we definitely try to have these conversations, and there have been times when we've had a particular article out. This happened only a few months ago, actually, and this actually takes us very well into the next topic in our podcast, where we had a piece by a writer talking about anti-Semitism within the Labour Party, and it was a bit controversial. And the very next day, we had a response by someone who sent quite a fiery email and said this article was not okay. And we said, well, we're committed to providing perspectives. And within 2 days, somebody else submitted an article saying, can we talk about this? These are the things I found wrong. We said, okay, well, this was a well thought out, well structured rebuttal. So we published that as well within 3 days of the first piece coming out. So the same platform had an original thesis, and someone finding flaws in that argument as well. And we thought that it was important for both sides to have their say.
Yeah, that's the thing, because it's not just about all viewpoints, because obviously we have, a limited amount that we can publish. As much as anything, it's about interesting, unique perspectives, things that really make you think, things that make you consider issues in a different light, perhaps. And of course, that's all subjective, but it's our mission to try and find the things which are interesting and present them to our viewers. And it is funny how sometimes people accuse us of putting forward a perspective. People will say, "Oh, is this what Conatus News thinks about this?" When very often we just think it's a viewpoint worth hearing, worth discussing, worth considering, because you have to, even if you don't like an argument, you don't agree with it, even if you hate it, you have to recognize that argument exists if you want to be able to challenge it and respond to it. So as you say, we have covered both sides of this anti-Semitism issue in Labour, and I expect we will continue to cover both sides, because it's a conversation which needs to be had. How can we know what the truth is if we're not prepared to consider both sides of the argument, or, well, more than two sides, because there is more than two sides of any argument. So it's really about listening to all of the arguments, looking at all of the evidence, and then coming to a conclusion based on that, not making up your mind first and then sifting through the arguments and the evidence to find those things which most support your position, and then only presenting those.
Yeah, no, I agree. And that's the thing. As long as the argument is internally consistent and is logical and makes sense from their perspective, we say to put it out there. And sometimes we do get backlash. We don't always only put out pieces that find favor with our reader base. We've had a few pieces that has been responded to with a lot of disapproval or vehemence, and that's good, because that's also a way for us to feel the pulse of the people on some issues, because sometimes you might think, well, this is probably not controversial, and then you put it out, and you know that, oh, okay, there's a lot more people who have very strong views on this. So yeah.
So let's talk a little bit more in depth about this anti-Semitism in the Labour Party issue. And Sarah talked a little bit about this on our previous podcast, and unfortunately I had to cut that out for time. But I just want to talk a little bit about anti-Semitism as a whole, because I think it's quite an interesting, tragic for Jewish people, of course. I think we're all familiar with the fact that anti-Semitism goes back for thousands of years. The Jewish legends about being expelled from Egypt, we know that they were expelled from Babylonia. And this is interesting because part of the issue with dealing with anti-Semitism is that some religious Jews have come to believe that their persecution is a product of their faith itself. It is essentially a curse placed upon God's chosen people. And that can sometimes make it difficult to unravel what's going on, because if you believe that wherever you go, you will be hated and you will be persecuted, then of course you will be prone to anticipating that persecution and expecting persecution and reading into everything persecution. Now, of course, that doesn't mean that there isn't real anti-Semitism out there. Sarah said last week it's one of the largest problems worldwide in terms of prejudice. And one of the things that we have to be aware of is survivor's bias. Jewish people have existed for thousands of years, and they've been dispossessed for thousands of years, living in Islamic, in Christian countries. Yes, they've been persecuted for all that time, but they have survived all of that time. So a lot of groups which are subject to persecution will disappear. They will be assimilated or be wiped out of existence one way or other. And Jewish people have managed to survive, and that in itself is something remarkable. And that is one of the large reasons why they have such a long history of persecution, because they have had such a long history.
Yeah, no, I definitely think that it is becoming slightly difficult to separate the strains of anti-Semitism and what may sometimes just be an attack for any other reason, or persecution or prejudice just based on a general xenophobia, perhaps, that's not directed at Jews, but directed at a lot of groups. And yet it is perceived as anti-Semitism as well. And I also think that there was a great piece a few days ago that there are forms of anti-Semitism. We obviously know that there is some anti-Semitism coming from more fundamentalist Islamic groups or preachers, not necessarily entire populations, but there is a strain in there. And there's also anti-Semitism coming from the white supremacist faction in North America. And there's also strains of anti-Semitism within Christian communities. And this goes back to what you were saying, Dan, that there's a long history, but we do have to be careful. And I think it's good to recognize that the sources may differ. And so the way you address it should also differ.
Exactly.
Yeah, because if you're going to conflate, say, the anti-Semitism from the more fundamentalist Islamic groups with the white supremacist kind of anti-Semitism, you have a problem. You know, you could say that, and you have a problem in your discourse as well, because you are suddenly, and in extreme irony, kind of clubbing together two groups who are themselves very opposed to each other. And you can see this in conversations sometimes when, you know, one person would defend or try to mitigate the anti-Semitism emerging from one of these groups, and they're suddenly called an apologist for the other.
So the kinds of anti-Semitism that we see in the Labour Party, I think will be primarily two kinds. First of all, as you say, originating from the people with people may have real, genuine objections to Israel, but those objections are mixed in and conflated with some kind of general prejudice. People believe that, you know, the problems with Israel are somehow a problem with Jewish people in particular, rather than with attitudes that you can find anywhere in the world. And then, on the other hand, you have the conspiracy theory type anti-Semitism. Now, conspiratorial anti-Semitism has a history going back at least a few hundred years, and it's always, unfortunately, been a sort of cheap substitute for anti-capitalism. So anyone who's familiar with the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, this is a fabricated text which claims to be the plans of the Jews to take over the world. And these protocols were created by the Russian Tsarist secret police at a time where there was very strong socialist activity. So it's no surprise that you occasionally get this sort of overlap where people who are incapable of really understanding the processes of economics and just want some group to blame, some group in the upper echelons of society, it's easier to say, well, there isn't really a problem with capitalists and bankers and so on, not all of them. It's just a problem with the Jewish bankers, the Jewish capitalists. So you get this kind of anti-Semitism seeping into left-wing movements. This was always a way to drag supporters away from genuine socialist movements and direct them towards anti-Semitism, which is just another reason why the left should be even more aware of anti-Semitism within their ranks, because it detracts from the real issues, which is confronting economic inequality. Because when you are blaming it on some small conspiratorial group, then you're refusing to deal with the issues as a whole.
Of course, yeah.
So this issue with Jeremy Corbyn, with the far left in general, that's the basis for the perspective that we should be coming at towards understanding the problems of the Labour Party. And it is a real problem when criticism of Israel is conflated with anti-Semitism, and this happens on both sides in terms of people who are critics of Israel can take this to some kind of they can take their criticism of Israel into condemnation of Jewish people in general, and people who want to defend Israel, on the other hand, will conflate any criticism of Israel with condemnation of the Jews in general. So we have to see how there are people on both sides who are taking a real issue, which is the problems of Israel in the Middle East, and turning it into a weapon on one side or another, a tool of racism, and a way to use that racism to defend practices which are otherwise unjustifiable. So I'm skeptical of a lot of the criticism of Jeremy Corbyn. On the other hand, I understand where Jewish people, Jewish groups are coming from, in that nobody wants to feel like they are being unfairly singled out. If it seems like somebody is endorsing or being sympathetic to what you perceive as prejudice, that's quite distressing. But you do have to, in that case, develop quite a nuanced view of what is prejudice. So a big deal has been made out of Jeremy Corbyn commenting on a painting, and this is from 6 years ago, which is being brought up now to either suggest that Jeremy Corbyn endorsed anti-Semitic paintings, or to say that he wasn't being harsh enough. And so this painting, I haven't really done any in-depth analysis of it, but it seems to me that this painting was connected to the conspiratorial element. Whether it was inherently anti-Semitic is difficult, because all of these conspiracy theories are unfortunately interlinked with anti-Semitism at this point, and the mural was a caricature of various figures, which includes Jewish figures, the Rothschilds and so on. And this is really difficult because I hate caricatures in general. I find them sort of inherently repulsive to exaggerate people's physical features. But on the other hand, I've always defended the artist's right to depict people in such a manner. And it can be difficult to know whether an artist is drawing a caricature simply for the sake of a caricature, or whether they're trying to imply something about someone's ethnicity, someone's genetic features. So, depicting Jews with big noses, for example, exaggerating people's facial figures, I find it inherently repulsive. But on the other hand, it's difficult to say that someone who draws caricatures is inherently being prejudiced towards a particular racial group, especially when they are making caricatures in general and not simply caricaturing a racial group. So there was criticism of Charlie Hebdo, for example, but they always caricatured everyone. And I think I don't know what the intentions of this painter was. I don't know whether they are anti-Semitic, but the fact that they referred to some of the figures as leading figures from the Jewish community, let's say the Rothschilds and so on, given that other figures in the painting were not Jewish people, in my mind, that means that it's not inherently anti-Semitic. Now, as I say, the painter may well have had anti-Semitic intentions, but to conclude that because they were caricatures and some of the figures in the painting were Jewish people, that therefore it is anti-Semitic. To say that it is anti-Semitic to draw caricatures of people who happen to be Jewish, if we are to say that we should never again make any caricatures of Jewish people, then we should also never again make caricatures of people from the Middle East, of black people. In fact, we should never make caricatures of anybody, lest it be perceived as a caricature of their race in general, rather than a general caricature. So this argument holds no real water for me. I think to have a blanket condemnation of caricatures is just impossible. Now, I would be perfectly happy if from this moment on, nobody ever made any caricatures of any human being ever again. That would be a perfectly valid outcome, but we cannot possibly enforce this, and we cannot possibly accuse everybody who draws a caricature of being prejudiced towards the kind of people who happen to be in those caricatures. I think you have to be quite nuanced as to the intention of a caricature, because I remember the condemnations of Charlie Hebdo. It was completely reactionary, completely point-blank eagerness to condemn them for a point of view which people didn't even take the time to understand. And I found it reprehensible at the time to jump to a condemnation of Charlie Hebdo for caricaturing Muslim people, caricaturing immigrants, when, from my perspective, it was clear that Charlie Hebdo was always in favor of immigration. They were always defended immigrants. Their caricatures are just by the nature of the cartoons they draw. So I am skeptical that this painter was being deliberately anti-Semitic in their drawings. Furthermore, this painting was from 6 years ago, and Jeremy Corbyn left a simple comment, which was, why did people object to your painting? Now, that could be a lack of analysis from Jeremy Corbyn's part, but are we supposed to examine every painting, every article that we comment on, to dig into that person's history to find out whether they had something which could be interpreted as anti-Semitic or prejudiced? I think that's going too far. I think that's asking for far too much oversight from anyone. Even the leader of a national political party cannot possibly have that kind of oversight. I mean, if you're asking us to be careful about what we comment on, what we like, the groups that we follow on Facebook, I agree. You do have to be careful about what you're supporting. But dredging this up now and presenting it as clear-cut evidence of Jeremy Corbyn supporting an anti-Semitic, an obviously anti-Semitic painting, I think is going far too far. I understand how Jewish people might feel, but I think that the reaction has been blown up way too far. I think that this is politically motivated to some degree. Although again, my sympathy towards people who feel like there is a real problem, and I think there is a problem in Labour in general. They do have to make sure that they're not allowing criticism of Israel to spill over into anti-Semitism, and criticism of capitalism, again, does not spill over into anti-Semitism. But there are people who are desperate to find anything they can to throw at Jeremy Corbyn. And this is not about Jeremy Corbyn in particular. I'm not Jeremy's biggest fan. But I've seen this with Labour Party figures for a long time. Ed Miliband, the Daily Mail tried to accuse his father of hating Britain because he was a Marxist. He was he was a Marxist, and therefore he was a traitor to Britain. So I'm not going to jump on any bandwagon on condemning a Labour figure when I think that that certain accusations are unfounded and are being levelled for political reasons. And I'm not saying that everyone who thinks that Jeremy Corbyn has a blind spot when it comes to anti-Semitism, or that we need to do more to deal with anti-Semitism in the Labour Party. I'm not saying that everyone who thinks that he is doing it for a political reason. And I think that we have to listen to people who have genuine concerns and bring those concerns on board. But when you have those concerns, I think what you have to do is work with people, work with them to show them how they can do better, to help them to identify anti-Semitism in the future, and not simply treat them as someone who is totally unsympathetic towards your cause, to write them off as unsavable, which I believe has happened to some degree with Jeremy Corbyn. And then again, he met with a Jewish group for Passover, and of course he was condemned for that because this Jewish group disagrees with the interpretation of Jeremy Corbyn and with some of these accusations of anti-Semitism, even though this Jewish group has fought anti-Semitism in the Labour Party in the past. And again, I'm not the biggest fan of this Jewish group. They seem rather extreme to me. But condemning someone for meeting with a Jewish group because they happen to hold views which you disagree with, I think is totally unfair. Yeah, of course he's going to spend some time with Jewish groups he agrees with. I mean, he definitely should reach out to Jewish groups who disagree with him. But again, there has to be give and take. There has to be willingness to sit down on both sides. And you can't fault people for spending time speaking to people who they agree with, because that's just the nature of politics.
That's just the nature of humans.
Yeah, I mean, if you expect Jeremy Corbyn to throw himself on the mercy of groups which disagree with his political perspectives in other areas, of course he's not going to do that. So the other issue that we've had in British politics the last few weeks is this poisoning,
Yes.
the Novichok nerve agent, the attempted assassination of a former Russian agent who came over to our side. And this is a circumstance where I'm going to, if you like, join the other side and turn on Jeremy Corbyn's side, if you like, because I'm really concerned about the level of cynicism which people are applying, and I totally understand that cynicism. I think Tony Blair jumping on the Republicans' bandwagon, the US Republicans' bandwagon, jumping into Iraq with faulty intelligence, has soured the British public, and I think this was a terrible move on Tony Blair's part. I think it's alienated a lot of the British public, and it has turned people towards conspiracy theories. However, this is not the Iraq war. All of the European nations which have rallied behind the UK in this instance, I think, is evidence enough that whatever the intelligence that the UK has, which paints Russia as the culprit, I believe that intelligence to be sound. And to cast doubt on that intelligence is not just to cast doubt on the British government, which I totally understand. And I think, again, the British government has made a number of mistakes which have merely encouraged conspiracy theories. I think Boris Johnson has put his foot in his mouth once again. I think he is an awful politician who has made gaffe after gaffe. And I don't want to, again, sound too partisan, but I do think that left-wing politicians, every little thing they do gets scoured over, whether they're holding a banana, eating a bacon sandwich, commenting on a Facebook post from 6 years ago, whereas Boris Johnson can actually say some quite racist things and somehow get away with it. He's still allowed to be a major player in the Conservative Party, and yet he makes mistake after mistake, and I think this is awful. And in this case, Boris Johnson, now he didn't specifically say that the British chemicals lab which analysed this substance, he did not specifically say that they had confirmed it was Russia, but he failed to make it clear that the job of this lab was not to point the finger at Russia, but rather to identify the substance involved. And the substance involved was a Russian nerve agent. And what the British government did was they took this identification of the nerve agent, they combined it with other intelligence they had, which they have not made public, which we have to presume that they haven't made public for genuine security reasons. And they have come to the conclusion that this is almost certainly Russia's doing. And as I say, we don't have to simply trust the British government on this issue, because that intelligence has been shared with the rest of Europe, and the rest of Europe have come to the conclusion that it was indeed almost certainly Russia behind this attack. And the media has also been at fault, being sensationalist, jumping on the fact that the lab has come out and say, look, we are not pointing the finger at Russia, and they are totally right not to point the finger at Russia, because their job was never to identify Russia. Their job was to identify the nerve agent, which they have done. It's as if there was a murder, which there almost has been, and we have had a coroner who examined the body and identified the weapon which was used to commit the murder. This is the job of the medical examiner to find out what the murder weapon was. And in this case, the lab discovered that the murder weapon was the Novichok nerve agent. And once the murder weapon has been identified, that evidence can then be used to identify the culprit, which it has in this case. Now, of course, on the other hand, we do have to take into account the potential use of this for propaganda purposes, and we know that Putin and the Russian government will use this for propaganda purposes. They will use this to push for a further confrontation with the West, and I do believe that it may be a mistake to give him too much of that confrontation. We don't want to beat the war drums, because all that will do is shore up Putin's support and shore up support for our own government at home. I believe that opinion polls have gone in Theresa May's favour over this latest incident, even though have not necessarily handled this in the best light possible. But governments, politicians will always use this kind of confrontation to bolster their support back home. They will always try and put on a show of strength. They want to be seen to be protecting their nation, standing up for the British people, standing up for British interests. And we always have to be careful of that. Because it's been said that patriotism is the last refuge of the scoundrel, but I disagree. I think patriotism is the first refuge of the scoundrel. It is the easiest. It is the easiest motivation in politics to claim, and it is most dangerous. So we do have to be cautious about how we handle this. But on the other hand, I think stirring up conspiracy theories is also incredibly dangerous. And this is the thing, because the problem with conspiracy theories is, just like with anti-Semitism, governments have used conspiracy theories for hundreds of years to manipulate people. And we've seen this over and over again. And a willingness to disbelieve what the establishment are telling us, a willingness to disbelieve what the government is telling us, actually just opens us up to a willingness to believe what other people are telling us. And these other people are just as likely to have nefarious agendas. These other people are just as likely to be other governments. Putin has ruthlessly exploited this. Not just Putin, but other governments around the world have recognized this and seized on this and are deliberately attempting to sow division, sow discord. They've been supporting both far left and far right elements. And whether this has had a huge effect, I don't know. But the fact is that they are trying it. And we have to be on our toes. We have to be aware. There's no point in accusing everybody of being Putin trolls, Putin bots, because that kind of speculation is totally pointless and it's just furthering the division. But we do have to be aware of multiple agendas out there, not just our own governments, but of the agendas of other governments. And just take this into account and be cautious. Just because something is willing to go against the establishment does not mean it's not part of another establishment.
That's very true, Dan. And my sense is, how do we approach each and every situation? Because on the one hand, we do need to not absolutely trust world politicians, of course, but at the same time, we don't want to also buy in to every anti-establishment narrative. And I think it comes down to what tools we have at our disposal in order to assess a given situation or a given scenario. So, as you so rightly pointed out, in this case, in the Skripal case, once it happened, there was speculation. I think it's understandable that the public be cautious about it. But after the agent was identified, British intelligence has obviously communicated with the government, and if all of Europe has decided that this information is credible enough, then I think the burden of credibility shifts. And at that point, it may not be still wise to believe any narrative that just goes against the government. It's still good to be cautious. But I think that's the point at which we start to ask ourselves, okay, if I'm going to distrust my government on this, what do they have to gain? What do they have to lose? Who else is affirming them? And who is disputing them? Because obviously other European allies and the US don't have a vested interest in stirring up war with Russia, whereas other diplomats are only going to do this if they find that there's reason to believe something is wrong. And I think that's the question for us to, when we go forward, is that in political discourse, especially when it's a controversy, how do we, the regular public, process this information? Do we believe everything in the papers? Maybe not. We may not want to. History has taught us to the contrary. But at the same time, we should be able to evaluate for ourselves why we distrust or trust a certain narrative. I mean, it did seem to me that perhaps Corbyn's caution may be actuated by the extreme of the other side, Johnson's gaffes, as you said, because it was very evident that Boris Johnson was coming out with unsupported statements before a time of wisdom, so to speak. So it could be that the leader of the opposition felt, compelled to sort of put the brakes on something and be like, "Whoa, can we hold up a bit?" I do think it's wise to give him the benefit of the doubt at that time. But then when you had more information, obviously, a responsible leader of the opposition has to consider whether he wants to sort of, churn up these conspiracy theories. Both sides have to be given the benefit of the doubt. But the point that we have to ask ourselves is, at what point does the evidence in favor of one particular narrative reach a certain point where you could say, okay, at this point, I'm going to start believing these guys. But from sort of going slightly back to the anti-Semitism issue, I wanted to ask your thoughts on this. A lot of people online, especially Jeremy Corbyn supporters, and I've seen even some Jewish groups saying this, is that if it came down to it, and if you were actually under attack, if the Jewish groups was actually under attack, racist attack, which political leader would they trust to be by their side? The guy with a history of fighting racism, of the left-wing politician with commitment to socialist ideals and to anti-racism and anti-imperialism, or are they going to trust the conservative politicians who maybe they're not that controversial? And this is to me a very interesting, controversy, because on the one hand, you have this leader who's being accused of anti-Semitism, but on the other, it simply does not jive with some of the history. And there is a history of anti-racist activism. And so I wanted to, I thought you could, as a native, express your thoughts on that. Do you think that of all the politicians most visible in Britain at the moment, if there was a racism issue rearing its head in Britain, the first politician to speak up on that would be Jeremy Corbyn?
Well, I mean, I suppose it's difficult to say, because we do have racism issues in this country, and I would trust Jeremy Corbyn more than Theresa May, although I do support Labour in general. It is interesting. I am concerned with some of the anti-Semitic elements of the Labour Party, but the Conservative Party has a long history of harbouring racist elements, at least more so than the Labour Party. Although, in fact, you can find people who are racist in various ways. You can find people who are prejudiced in various ways in the Labour Party. There will be local councillors. There are some Labour MPs which I find awful. But when push came to shove, absolutely, I would trust the Labour Party. I would trust Jeremy Corbyn. And part of that is because the Labour activists are far more likely to get out on the streets. And when you have far-right groups threatening people in the streets, whether they be whether they be, white supremacists, whether they be even Muslim extremists, Islamic extremists, I would still trust the left to directly protect people more than the conservatives, at least. And even those groups which have been set up on the right to defend against, say, Islamic extremism, I still would not trust them to protect ordinary people. If you look at the backgrounds of a lot of people involved, you have football hooligans, and these kind of people are looking for a fight. And yes, they can be potentially in the moment useful in, say, standing up to some kind of Islamist march, whatever. These are people who are looking for a fight for the sake of it. And as soon as they are done dealing with these people who are obviously abhorrent, they will turn on anyone else who happens to be an easy target. So I do not trust the right wing whatsoever, the nationalist right in particular. I do not trust them when it comes to any issues of prejudice, racism, of violence, terrorism, even issues of free speech. And we've seen people on the right take up the cause of free speech. But do I believe their intentions are good? Absolutely not. Yes, there are problems with free speech on the left at the moment. But the right has taken up causes of free speech in a purely self-serving manner. And some of the people they are defending are beyond the pale. I think that there are limits to free speech, although, of course, I am generally in favor of free speech in general. I'm in favor of listening to people with abhorrent ideas. But that doesn't mean that in every case I'm going to take their side. And it doesn't mean that I'm going to join up with people who are on the right wing, because the right wing conservatives have, again, a long history of suppressing freedom of speech, of opposing letting people speak, and as soon as this controversy with Islam with the left is over, they will go right back to their usual ways.
Yeah.
So,
yeah, right. No, the issue of free speech and how we deal with it is obviously a very delicate one, and I think that, again, it has to be treated with nuance, because we do have to still make a distinction between free speech as controlled by the government, free speech that's, well, yes, deplatforming sources to free speech, things that are simply companies cutting you off, just people refusing to publish your work, or quite simply just, not employing people with certain views. There are levels, and to put it all under the umbrella of an attack on free speech is also incorrect. And certainly, I think some marginalized groups have cause to fear. It's simply not enough for people to say, well, fight ideas with ideas. But that is a much larger topic, which I hope we will be able to get into in some detail. No, I mean, I'm not in favor of restrictions, but I think one has to listen to those concerns and find ways of working around it or addressing them, rather than simply saying, well, tough luck. This is just how it is. Because that's not how it works in reality. People do absorb bad ideas. People act on bad ideas, and the victims are often the weak and marginalized groups. And they have cause to fear speech at times.
Yeah. One of the things that I wanted to come back to, so both of the topics that we've covered today, the anti-Semitism issue, the Russian poisoning case, we've touched on conspiracy theories in both of those topics. And this is a real concern of mine, the breakdown in people's trust in institutions. And I find this very concerning because I think that there are genuine reasons for people to be concerned about institutions. And on the other hand, if that breakdown occurs, if people lose trust in their governments, people lose trust in science, and so on, I think the end result of that would be a complete breakdown in society, essentially. Every day, everything we do, we have to put our trust in the expertise, the abilities, the knowledge of other people. Our society is so complex that you cannot go a single day without putting your faith in other people. Whether you drive a car, you put faith in the engineers who design and build the car. You put faith in the company which produced that car. You have faith in the other drivers on the road. You have faith that the traffic lights will work properly. You have faith that the police will only stop you if they have genuine cause. There is so much trust that goes into maintaining our society as it is. And if that trust breaks down, then everything in our society breaks down. And if everything in our society breaks down, then everything that we have, our entire civilization, if you like, and I mean civilization, in a global sense, everyone has their own kind of civilization, that civilization will collapse. If you look at history, and we are far beyond ancient history, of course, different kinds of societies, different mechanisms. But if you look at the collapses which happened in various societies throughout history, it's happened because of overcomplication, over-reliance on systems. And when one element of that system failed, when one element of that system collapsed, it all came down like a house of cards. Just one element fell and everything else came collapsing around it. And that's a real concern. Now, of course, people have predicted, the end of the world, Armageddon, apocalypse, whatever, constantly throughout history. And so far, we've managed to stumble through. But of course, if someone had in the past been right, then we wouldn't be here today to reflect on that. So that doesn't mean that we should be entirely complacent. And the thing with society today is our technology is becoming more and more complex, more and more powerful. Science is incredibly advanced. Every little piece of technology has been amazingly machine developed. It relies on the technology of hundreds of years. Everyone's expertise builds upon the knowledge and expertise of so many other people. And so it's a real concern, both in terms of the trust people have in our institutions, in their systems, and also in terms of how much do we have to be genuinely concerned? Because we genuinely cannot evaluate all of the science by ourselves, okay? All of the scientific research that's going on, we can't read all of the research that's been published. We can't evaluate it. We have to rely on other scientists to read it and say, yeah, that seems good, that seems legitimate. And especially now when we have people claiming all sorts of things in the name of science, right? We have people who are claiming that their racist prejudices are backed up by science. And people claiming that all sorts of gender differences are based in science. And it is very difficult for an average person to figure out who's really telling the truth, what's really going on here. And so I do think we need to have, there needs to be something of a reckoning. For all that I criticize people who rail on the establishment, I do think the establishment has been complacent. And we do need some way to bring the general public more on board with the research that's being done. And I do think we need more rigorous procedures when it comes to publications, because I think there is a lot of stuff being published which is misleading. And we need to be very careful how this is reported, because when it comes to science reporting, the media is absolutely awful about it. We have seen things over and over again. A preliminary study which suggests some indication of one effect from another, and the media declares this as, definitive proof one way or another.
You're very right. Yeah, no, that is, of course, a lot different issue. The issue of how we take on board scientific research that especially has large social implications, and that again goes to how we evaluate the information that's given to us. But yeah, I think we need to wrap up.
So let's call it there. Thank you very much for joining me, Beatrice.
Thank you.
We've been glad to have you on here. Thank you all for listening. Hope you've appreciated our conversation today. Do leave a like if you've enjoyed the content. Subscribe to our YouTube channel if you want to hear more from us. Leave a comment if there's anything you'd like to say. Do donate to our Patreon. I will leave a link in the description of this video. And hopefully you will check out our site, Conatus News, as well. And I will see you next week. Goodbye from me, Dan Fisher, and from Beatrice.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Goodbye.